what is the secret for three guys in ZZ Top? And we've been at this, we being ZZ Top.
Z-Top always looked solid from the outside. They were three guys with one sound and a tight setup that never seemed to waver. They kept the same lineup for decades, stayed out of scandals, and let the music do the talking. With the beards, the riffs, and the humor, they built a lasting band that is rock music. But that wasn't the full story, because behind the scenes, things were far more complicated. There were private struggles, personal losses, and decisions that didn't always sit well within the group. However, now we finally understand what truly went on behind the scenes of one of the most iconic rock bands of all time. And once you see the full picture, it changes everything you thought you knew about ZZ Top. The making of Billy Gibbons. Before ZZ Top grew their beards and became one of the most iconic blues rock bands in history, before the worldwide tours, the platinum records, and the unforgettable music videos that came to define MTV's early years, Billy Gibbons was just a boy born into music, raised on rhythm, and pulled by a deeper, quieter hunger to create something that felt true. Billy Gibbons was born on December 16, 1949, in the heart of Houston, into a family that deeply appreciated music. His father, Frederick Royal Gibbons, was not only a concert pianist, but also a conductor and entertainer, working closely with MGM Studios and producing for stars like Nat King Cole and B.B. King. And this meant that from a young age, Billy was drawn to rhythm in all its forms. What most people don't realize is that before he ever picked up a guitar, Billy was classically trained in percussion. He studied the drums as a child, going through the structured, disciplined world of classical music, learning how timing, tone, and space could build emotion without ever needing lyrics. But for Billy, while the precision of drums was grounding, it wasn't freeing. He wanted something different. And that something arrived in the form of the blues. In particular, Gibbons became a devoted listener of Lightnin' Hopkins, a fellow Houston native whose stripped-down style embodied the grit of Texas blues. Hopkins's influence on Gibbons was more than stylistic. It was personal. His guitar playing felt like storytelling, and his voice carried the sound of someone who had lived through what he was singing. Through Hopkins, Billy discovered other talents like Muddy Waters, Jimmy Reed, and Howlin' Wolf, and each of them helped build his understanding of what the blues really meant. He studied their styles obsessively and absorbed the feeling behind them. As Gibbons got older, his commitment to the blues only deepened. He explored the sounds of Chicago blues and the Delta blues, as well as local Texas styles. He began to refine his guitar playing, moving from simple imitation to experimentation with tone and texture. He wasn't trying to play fast or flashy. He was chasing something specific, a sound that was authentic, expressive, and rooted in tradition. By the late 1960s, Houston was part of a broader cultural shift. Psychedelic music was taking hold in cities like San Francisco and Austin. In this wave of experimentation, Gibbons formed a band called the Moving Sidewalks, a four-piece psychedelic rock group that included Don Summers on bass, Dan Mitchell on drums, and Tom Moore on keyboards. With the Moving Sidewalks, Gibbons stepped into a very different musical space. The band embraced the acid rock aesthetic, incorporating fuzzed-out guitars, reverb, and lyrical themes that reflected the era's fascination with consciousness and counterculture. The group released a full-length album titled Flash in 1969, as well as several singles that became local hits. Though it was a major departure from his blues roots, Gibbons used this time to expand his technical skills and explore different aspects of songwriting and production. He modified his gear, experimented with feedback, and began to build the unique guitar tone that would later become his signature. It was a period of growth, but also one of tension, because the longer he spent immersed in the psychedelic scene, the more he felt disconnected from the emotional simplicity that had first drawn him to music. Still, the experience with the Moving Sidewalks brought him important exposure. In 1968, the band landed a spot as the opening act for the Jimi Hendrix Experience during their United States tour. It was during this time that Billy Gibbons and Jimi Hendrix struck up a brief but impactful friendship. Hendrix was famously impressed with Gibbons' playing, In one televised interview, Hendrix even named Billy as one of the best up-and-coming guitarists in America. But this praise didn't distract Gibbons from the inner conflict he was beginning to feel. Despite the buzz around the band, Gibbons began growing restless. The psychedelic sound no longer satisfied him. It felt overly experimental and increasingly detached from the earthy, unfiltered blues he loved. He missed the rhythm of a slow blues shuffle, and he wanted to bring that sound back, not in the form of imitation, but reinvention. By the end of 1969, the Moving Sidewalks had effectively disbanded. Billy was no longer interested in acid rock or abstract lyrics. He had seen the industry up close, opened for legends, and played to big crowds. But what he wanted was something smaller, tighter, and more rooted. He wanted to create a sound that paid tribute to Texas, but didn't get stuck in the past. And so, he decided to build a band of his own from scratch. He began searching for talented minds to complete the band, and that search led him to two men and to the creation of ZZ Top, the rise of ZZ Top. In 1969, Billy Gibbons knew exactly what he wanted. He'd seen the psychedelic scene up close, learned from legends, and come full circle back to the blues. But now he was ready to build something new, stripped down, hard-hitting, and unmistakably Texan. That same year, he found two like-minded musicians who would complete the picture. Frank Beard, a drummer from Dallas with both jazz finesse and rock edge, was the first to join. Beard had already played in several Texas bands and had a reputation for being tight, versatile, and steady. He brought in Dusty Hill, a bassist and vocalist who had played with Beard in a band called American Blues. Hill's voice had grit, and his playing had groove. More importantly, he understood the kind of sound Billy was aiming for. With Billy on guitar and lead vocals, Dusty on bass and harmonies, and Frank on drums, the trio came together as ZZ Top. The name was short, sharp, and strange, just like the band itself. From the beginning, the chemistry was clear, and the groove was undeniable. This was a band that knew how to do more with less. Their early albums were raw and authentic, filled with Texas blues riffs, simple storytelling, and a laid-back swagger that felt both classic and fresh. ZZ Top's first album dropped in 1971, followed by Rio Grande Mud in 1972. Both records were modest commercial successes, but they helped carve out the band's identity. The songs had character, and Billy's tone was thick and greasy. Dusty's harmonies added punch, while Frank's drumming kept everything grounded. This wasn't music for the coasts, it was music for the backroads, the bars, and the garages of the South. But it was 1973's Tres Hombres that changed everything. The album's lead single, La Grange, was a breakout hit and a tribute to a real-life Texas brothel, built on a hypnotic blues riff and a howling vocal. The song took off on the radio, and the album became ZZ Top's first commercial breakthrough. Suddenly, they weren't just a regional act, they were a national band with a distinct, unmistakable sound. By the mid-1970s, ZZ Top was no longer playing small venues. They had entered the arena rock era, and they embraced it. In 1976, they launched the worldwide Texas Tour, one of the most ambitious stage productions of the time. The band performed on a massive Texas-shaped stage, complete with live animals, cacti, and a backdrop of desert landscapes. The tour covered more than 90 cities and ran for over a year. It wasn't just about music, it was a full visual experience, crafted to leave a lasting impression. But even at this scale, the band remained surprisingly tight. Unlike many rock bands of the 70s, ZZ Top didn't expand their lineup or add extra musicians. The three-piece format stayed intact. And while the image of the band was evolving, with longer beards, mirrored sunglasses, and cowboy hats, the core sound was still blues-based rock. Things changed drastically for the band. In 1983, with the release of Eliminator, an album that would redefine their career and introduce them to an entirely new generation. The record combined their blues rock roots with new synths, drum machines, and sequencers, creating a hybrid sound that felt both classic and futuristic. But it wasn't just the music that transformed the band, it was the visuals. The music videos from Eliminator were slick, humorous, and iconic, featuring fast cars, mysterious women, and ZZ Top's now legendary image, long beards, shades, and an almost cartoon-like coolness. The gamble worked, and Eliminator sold over 10 million copies in the United States alone. and turned ZZ Top into a global brand. For the first time, the band had broken through to mainstream pop audiences without abandoning their blues core. But despite the success, behind the scenes, things weren't always as polished as the videos. Inside that machine of humor and sunglasses, there were moments when the creative sparks turned into real friction, and that tension would eventually bubble to the surface in ways fans didn't always see: friction and controversies. For years, ZZ Top projected an image of unity, cool confidence, and effortless swagger. They were a trio that survived decades of musical evolution, thrived, and sold millions of records while keeping the same lineup intact. But behind the scenes, there were cracks that didn't always show in public. And soon, creative differences, industry pressure, and questions about direction began to chip away at the band's carefully controlled front. The tension started to build in the 1980s, just as the band was reaching the height of their commercial power. After years of sticking to their gritty Texas blues roots, the album Eliminator marked a bold shift. With the addition of drum machines, synthesizers, and a more polished, radio-friendly sound, ZZ Top reintroduced themselves to a new generation. But the transformation came at a cost. Some longtime fans and critics saw the use of synths and programmed beats as a departure from the band's soul. For them, the trio that once played raw Texas blues had now embraced a slick, digitized version of themselves. The same group that built its name on the simplicity of a three-piece blues setup was now using sequencers and layered effects. For certain audiences, it felt like a betrayal of the band's core identity. But it didn't end there, because within the band, creative priorities also began to shift. Billy Gibbons, ever curious and experimental with tone and studio technique, was enthusiastic about pushing boundaries. He welcomed the use of technology and saw it as a way to modernize their sound without abandoning their roots. But Dusty Hill and Frank Beard weren't always on the same page. While they adapted to the changes professionally, the evolution stirred internal tension. Hill, in particular, was more anchored in traditional blues, and the sudden move toward polished electronic elements sparked debates about authenticity versus innovation. The band didn't publicly argue, but insider reports noted a growing divide in their creative vision. Gibbons often took the lead in studio production and tone direction, while Hill and Beard sometimes felt sidelined. And this led to a slow accumulation of tension and disagreement. The band's music was changing, and not everyone agreed on how far it should go. As ZZ Top's fame grew, so did the accusations of selling out. Rock purists, blues historians, and longtime fans criticized the group's visual style as much as the music itself. The MTV videos, often centered around cars, girls, and stylized versions of masculinity, were seen by some as out of step with the blues ethos the band had once championed. And yet, despite the criticism, the records continued to sell. The group's reinvention had brought them unprecedented success. But it also raised new questions about the line between artistic growth and commercial compromise. Then came the less visible but equally real industry and legal challenges. In the early days, ZZ Top's management was handled by Bill Ham, a Texas-based producer who had helped shape their sound and style from the very beginning. Ham was known for keeping tight control over the band's business decisions. For years, the partnership worked. Ham understood the band's aesthetic and helped cultivate their mystique. But over time, financial disagreements and control issues began to surface. While the full details of their business disputes were never made fully public, rumors circulated about money mismanagement and contract concerns. There were quiet reports of behind-the-scenes legal discussions and restructuring of financial arrangements. These issues didn't explode in the press the way other rock band lawsuits often did, but they definitely left their mark. The tensions surrounding management decisions, especially as the band's profile grew in the 80s and early 90s, added another layer of stress to a group already navigating internal creative shifts. Beyond legal concerns, there was also the mounting pressure of expectation. As their public image became more stylized, the gap between how they were perceived and what they were experiencing privately grew wider. To the outside world, ZZ Top was a well-oiled machine, timeless, unchanging, and always in control. But inside, the balance was delicate. Each new record brought questions about direction, and each new tour brought questions about energy, motivation, and roles. The band had built a brand around unity and consistency, but that consistency came with weight. The longer they held the same lineup and same image, the more difficult it became to express individual creative needs. They weren't just musicians anymore. They were an institution, and institutions are harder to change. Still, the band kept the fractures private. Unlike many of their contemporaries, ZZ Top rarely aired grievances in public. There were no high-profile walkouts, no messy interviews, and no onstage meltdowns. But the fact that they never broke apart shouldn't be mistaken for a lack of tension. They held it together, but it wasn't always easy. As the years passed, the cool facade and unshakable stage presence continued to define them publicly. But behind it was the real strain of staying relevant, staying united, and staying true to something that had started in a much simpler time. They didn't show the pressure, but it was there. The long studio sessions, the disagreements over sound, the private doubts, the physical toll of relentless touring, and the balancing act of maintaining both loyalty to their legacy and a desire for evolution. And while the business and creative conflicts shaped much of the band's public trajectory, they weren't the only challenges. Because behind the music and the brand were individual men who were aging, changing, and facing private battles that had nothing to do with guitars or record deals. And while ZZ Top kept the same lineup for decades, each member walked his own path off stage, and not every chapter in that story was easy. Personal battles and tragedies behind the music. On stage, ZZ Top always looked untouchable. The synchronized swaying guitars, the identical sunglasses, and the beards that became cultural symbols all felt effortless. But behind that image, each member of the band faced personal struggles that didn't make headlines. In the 1970s, at the height of ZZ Top's rise, Frank Beard, the only member without a long beard despite his last name, was facing a battle that nearly took him down completely. While the band was selling out arenas and gaining critical acclaim for their raw, bluesy sound, Beard was privately sinking into an illicit substance addiction that escalated quickly. And as the pressures of touring, recording, and maintaining the ZZ Top machine increased, so did his dependence. Beard later described the period as chaotic and dangerous. He would go days without sleep, often using illicit substances just to stay functional enough to perform. In interviews, he admitted that he was spending more money on these substances than he was making from the band at one point. The situation grew more severe until it could no longer be hidden. By the late 70s, Beard had reached a breaking point. His health was deteriorating, his personal life was unraveling, and his bandmates were watching with concern. Eventually, Beard entered rehab and began the long, slow process of recovery. The decision wasn't just about getting clean, it was about survival. The fact that ZZ Top didn't fall apart during that period says a lot about the silent loyalty that existed between the three men. Beard's recovery didn't happen overnight, but over time he returned with a renewed focus. He stayed clean, kept his place in the band, and went on to perform for decades afterward. But the scars of that time never fully disappeared. For Billy Gibbons, the pressures of fame came in a different form. While he was always seen as the face of the band, the front man, the guitarist, and the unmistakable voice,
you gotta treat her right now. Let's give it to her.
Most fans never realized that he actually never seemed entirely comfortable in the spotlight. Those close to him often described Gibbons as a deeply private man, more at home in a quiet studio than on a red carpet. He was fascinated with sound, tone, and technical craft. But the flashiness that came with the band's 80s reinvention wasn't necessarily his natural instinct. It was just part of the performance. Off stage, Gibbons preferred solitude. He wasn't one for drama or excess, and he rarely let the public into his personal life. As the fame of ZZ Top skyrocketed, he stayed grounded by diving deeper into music, experimenting with gear, collecting guitars, and refining his style. He maintained a cool exterior, but the pressure to keep delivering hits, maintain the brand, and lead the band took its toll. For Gibbons, fame was a byproduct, not a pursuit, and he carried the burden of leadership quietly. Then there was Dusty Hill, the bassist and co-vocalist who provided not just the band's bottom end, but also its balance. Hill had always been the steady presence in ZZ Top. He was calm, dry-witted and dependable, and although he rarely sought the spotlight, his voice and playing were essential to the group's chemistry. For over 5 decades, he stood to Billy's right on stage, his harmony vocals filling the spaces, and his bass lines keeping the groove locked in. But behind the scenes, Hill's health had been declining for years. In 2000, Hill was diagnosed with hepatitis C, which forced the band to cancel shows and take an extended break. Though he recovered, it marked the beginning of intermittent health issues. Over the next 2 decades, he battled a series of medical challenges, some public but most private. In 2014, Hill fell on his tour bus and injured his hip, leading to surgery and more postponed dates. Despite his health setbacks, he always returned to the stage, but it wasn't long before his body finally began to slow down. In July 2021, Hill took a brief leave from touring, citing a hip issue. It was expected to be temporary. The band brought in their longtime guitar tech, Elwood Francis, to fill in for the remaining shows. But just a few days later, on July 28, 2021, Dusty Hill died in his sleep at his home in Houston. The news was sudden, and the band and the fans were totally devastated. For Billy Gibbons, the loss was devastating. They had played together for over 50 years, longer than most marriages and longer than most friendships survive. They had toured the world, built a brand, and created a sound that only worked because all 3 parts were in place. Hill's death wasn't just the loss of a bandmate, it was the loss of a musical twin, someone who had shared every step of the journey since day one. In later interviews, Gibbons spoke of Dusty's passing with a kind of quiet heartbreak. He revealed that Dusty had insisted the band continue without him, even suggesting that Elwood Francis take over if needed. It wasn't just a casual remark, it was a final wish. Gibbons respected that request, and the band played on. But there was no pretending it was the same. The stage was emptier, and the symmetry was gone. The emotional toll of losing someone who had stood beside you for more than 5 decades is hard to measure. They had grown old together on the road. They had shared stages, dressing rooms, hotel lobbies, and studio sessions. They had built something together that couldn't be duplicated, and so when Dusty died, a part of ZZ Top died too. And yet the music didn't stop. As hard as it was, the band continued touring. Elwood Francis stepped in, just as Dusty had asked, and the band honored his memory the only way they knew how, by playing the songs the way they always had, with grit, groove, and no apologies. Because for ZZ Top, survival wasn't about ignoring the loss, it was about carrying it forward. Where it all stands now. At 75 years old, Billy Gibbons is still doing what he's always done, and that's playing, touring, recording, and chasing tone. Age hasn't softened his edge or slowed down his work ethic. If anything, it's sharpened his focus. He doesn't try to compete with trends or chase relevance. Instead, he simply continues with the same steady, quiet conviction he had in the early days. In 2025, Gibbons remains a powerful presence, both on stage and off, not because he reinvents himself, but because he stays unapologetically himself. ZZ Top, now over half a century into their career, still tours regularly. The lineup looks different, but the energy hasn't disappeared. Elwood Francis, the longtime guitar tech turned bassist, now stands where Dusty Hill once did. For Gibbons and Frank Beard, continuing the band without Dusty was never going to be easy, but continuing because of Dusty gave it meaning. Elwood has stepped in respectfully, never trying to imitate Dusty, but playing in the spirit of what ZZ Top always was. The fans have responded with warmth, and although no one could truly replace Dusty Hill, the legacy continues in a way that feels earned, not forced. Outside of ZZ Top, Gibbons has also kept himself musically active. His solo work, which he began in earnest in 2015, has offered a looser, more experimental side of his creativity. Gibbons digs deeper into the rock and blues he's always loved, but with more room to stretch. He plays with different musicians, writes in a slightly different voice, and explores textures that ZZ Top's tighter format doesn't always allow. But his solo material doesn't aim for radio hits or awards. It's always personal, raw, and often reflective. The lyrics have become more pointed over time, and they touch on aging, loss, resilience, and legacy, but in a way that captures audiences. You see, Gibbons has never been the kind of artist to spell things out in interviews. but he's become more outspoken in his own way, not through headlines, but through his playing and writing. In his recent songs, there are moments that seem to nod directly to Dusty, to the weight of history, and to the strange reality of still being here when so many others are gone. He doesn't address it head-on, but the emotion is definitely there. There have also been rumors of unreleased ZZ Top material and songs that were recorded before Dusty's passing, possibly containing his final bass lines. While no official release has been confirmed, Gibbons has hinted in interviews that the band's archive runs deep. If such material exists, its eventual release would mark a poignant chapter in the ZZ Top story, one last echo of a voice that defined the band's sound for more than 5 decades. As of now, the band remains active. They continue to tour with a setlist that spans their full career and showcases their blues roots. The fans keep showing up, the band keeps showing up, and Billy Gibbons, now a rock elder statesman, is still performing with the same quiet cool that made him a legend in the first place. He's still doing the thing he set out to do as a teenager, listening to Lightnin' Hopkins records and making music that feels real, lived in, and full of soul. In a music world that often changes with each trend, ZZ Top's continued existence is a kind of defiance. They never rushed to modernize, and they never fractured or overexposed themselves. They've always kept things real. And in 2025, that choice feels even more rare, even more valuable. Billy Gibbons stands now not just as the last original member still active, but as the keeper of the ZZ Top spirit, a style, a tone, and a philosophy that has always been about doing more with less, playing it tight, and letting the music speak for itself. What's your favorite ZZ Top song? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you love juicy deep dives into celebrity lives, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new video.